So hello and welcome to our Work Plus Family Extra webinar on how to have better conversations about work and family at home. And this is the third and final webinar in our series on communication. It complements our other conversations on talking at work about work and family, and also how to talk so children will listen. So we've kind of been exploring this topic from all angles and hopefully providing some useful practical tips along the way. So I'm Emma Willows. I'm the Coaching and Consultancy Development Manager with My Family Care, and it's very much a client-facing role I have. And in addition, I have 3 children, so I manage family alongside work commitments, and hopefully in our conversation today I can bring my personal perspective too. And I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Susie Heyman. Hello, Susie.
Hello, Emma. Hello, and hello, everybody who's there.
And Susie is a trained relationship counsellor. She's a trustee of the family charity Family Lives, the Agony Aunt of Woman magazine, author of 30 books, regular broadcaster on national and local radio and television, an accredited parenting practitioner. And when she finds time, she's also a stepmom and a grandma to one granddaughter. And it's a real pleasure to have you alongside today. Thank you, Susie, for being here.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So what are we going to do? A few points before we begin. We are recording the session, so those of you who have a Work Plus Family space will find it archived after to perhaps listen or watch again or share with others. It might be your partner or others who may not be available to join us now. And we'll also be circulating a document. So shortly after the event, we're going to try and capture the top tips, the advice, the conversation we have, and put that into a 2-page document that will hopefully support as a takeaway. So it won't be available immediately, but we'll take some time to reflect and type that up and send it your way. So that's sort of how you can get at this content after our live session. We really urge you, please, to type in questions or make comments as we go. We're going to keep them as typed rather than unmute people. Just it works better that way for the number that we have. But we really welcome that, and we will be pausing as we go along. Where relevant, we'll chip in as the question comes in, but we also have a Q&A slot, so we may park some of your comments if you're not getting an immediate response. We'll be revisiting those later in the session in the time we've allocated. Before we finish, any resources that are talked about and additional ones will be reviewed, so you'll get a chance to see where you might go for further support, and also an opportunity to give us your feedback, please. I'm going to mention that now at the outset because it's so important to us. In the chat window at the end of the session, you'll find a quick survey, an online survey. Hopefully only take a couple of minutes of your time, but it really does help us give you, we hope, what you want. It really feeds into our planning and future webinar topics and formats. So why are we here? Well, you know, we're clearly keen on cooperating rather than competing. It's sometimes an ideal rather than a reality. At home, we often end up competing, and really one of the things that we'll do today is identify maybe how we can get better at anticipating and managing the pinch points that lead to conflict or competition that might be happening, and also conversations that are perhaps only going on in heads. How can we make sure they're happening and that the communication is flowing, it's open, and it's meaningful. We're going to look at ways, strategies for making that happen too. And really importantly, connect with others. That's why I urge you to type questions or make your comments as we go along, because we really will feed those in to the discussion. I think it can be helpful for others to feel that they're not alone in any of this. So our focus will be very much on what conversations we need to be having, and then practical tips on how we can have those conversations more effectively. And that's whether you're a male-female couple, a same-sex partnership, perhaps a blended family, separated, a boomerang kid, more from Susie on that later, or maybe you have an older dependent parent moving in or needing care. So all of those situations, we've got assumptions in there. We've got to address those and clearly communicate about who's doing what and avoid those conflict situations. Our objectives then, in a nutshell, will be to really start in terms of the agenda, looking at the changing context, what it is to be a contemporary parent, what it is to be caring in the 21st century, how has that changed, and what do we need to do to handle it all better? Look at the cultural drivers there, but also take a look at how we handle the often unrealistic expectations. As we'll hear from Susie, often these are found at the root of all discord or conflict, the expectations that we bring in to the home, and then how we can stay positive and really keep the partnership, whether we're remaining in a relationship, whether we're navigating care responsibilities following a separation or a divorce. How do we keep the partnership in whatever way effective, so that we can move forward and get away from some of the stress that a lot of us are encountering. So our aim today is to stimulate some thoughts and discussion, but ultimately to encourage some practical action. And I really want to say thank you to everybody for filling in the registration data so fully and so candidly, and I just want to offer back to you some of the key challenges that were there. Conflict was a word that came up in a number of your responses, and this idea of compromising too. So how do we fit it all in? You know, I really identify with this, with 3 children. You know, who gets what? How do I manage to give something to everyone? And how do I do that well? This challenge of, in a dual income or a dual career partnership, you know, this battle between whose career is more important. You know, how do we assess if there's a sick child, who's going to take that time to be at home with them, or who's going to manage a care challenge that comes your way? And often that can be a source of conflict as we compete over my meeting being more important than your meeting, for example. Some of that then leading to resentment, and the idea of who's doing what at home. How do we negotiate that domestic contract on whose job or what, who's taking the rubbish out, for example, and we'll hear a bit more from Susie on that, I'm sure. And a couple of you as well on the line with teenagers, you know, that challenge where you don't get that third part of the day, you don't get that time when the house is quiet, and you can just be, again, with older kids hanging around well into the evening, and sometimes in my case, wanting to go to bed after I've gone to bed, or at least I get more tired earlier. So how do we carve out the time that we need as our circumstances change, as our families grow? And I think, you know, it's really important that we do acknowledge that what we're facing today as parents is quite different to what we may have had modeled to us by our parents. There have been massive changes in how family is defined, who's breadwinning, co-breadwinning much more likely to be the model in households today. A very interesting Woman's Hour study, I don't know if any of you are aware of this, at the moment they're running a kind of chores wars, which is all over Facebook as well, a survey of who's doing which chores at home, just to get a real snapshot of family life. So clearly this is high up the agenda for a lot of people, and just that negotiation of what happens when you're both working and you're at full stretch. Also, I think crucially to acknowledge that many of us are working remotely now. You know, the internet means that sometimes, you know, work doesn't stay at work. It isn't a physical place anymore. It's via our smartphone, and that can be wherever we are. So how do we set parameters? We're going to take a look at that. And understanding as well what we now know about bonding and human caring, the idea of mum at home, that traditional model that's not that old, actually, just a generation, but how do we challenge those perceptions, challenge those images we get about how children need to be looked after? We know so much more now about multiple attachments that even very young children are making. How can we make that a reality or support that in the way we raise our families and manage the roles there? It's clear, we know as a society we have high levels of separation and divorce. Interesting statistic that nearly half of 16-year-olds have experienced this, so that's new territory too. And multi-generational households, certainly a number of my friends with older children experiencing the sort of empty nest, and it's only kind of short-lived, because then, you know what, they finish their course and they come straight back home again, particularly relevant in London, I think. A lot of older grown-up children coming back and sharing the home again. Obviously, things have shifted and levels of independence are different, but still, how do we negotiate that? How do we manage that? And it may be that we're caring for parents at home as well, or we have elder care responsibilities very high number, 125 million informal carers in Europe. So, that's something that is really shifting in terms of the domestic landscape too, that many of us are part of the sandwich generation, looking after our children, but at the same time making provision for our parents. So, Susie, it's very much a changed landscape, isn't it? We don't always have the reference of how our parents managed it, because such a lot is different.
Changed. And changing, and I think this is the point, that most of us obviously work on models. We do as our parents did, because that's how we learned to be parents. That's how we learn to be partners, in fact. We follow the model. And the change that has happened in the last 50 years is quite extreme, so that a lot of people do find it immensely difficult to try and even think about renegotiating. You fall back on the assumption of this is how it is, rather than being able to say, well, this is either how it's always been, or actually how it's been maybe in the last 100 years, but it wasn't before that. I mean, looking at this, for instance, I see two big returns. One of which is to the multi-generational households. That always how it used to be. The idea of the nuclear family, just mum and dad and their children, is in fact quite new and quite unusual. I mean, again, if you look all over the world, it's not something that is found everywhere, and it certainly wasn't found, several hundred years ago. And the other return, of course, is to the idea of work and home blending, that we have only really since the Industrial Revolution had the idea that people went out to work, and what happened at home was entirely divorced, entirely separated from what you did to earn your living. It used to be that actually it was all together. And the women then, maybe there was some division between, what men and women did in their home and workplace, but perhaps not as much as we now think. That's actually quite a new construct. So, we're cycling back, but we're still trying to operate with our own lives and our own children in a way that we've got these fixed ideas of what is right and what we expect ourselves to be able to do. And it does mean that an awful lot of people are absolutely stretched. Men as well as women. I think sometimes, as you said, Emma, this is about the housework stuff that's going on at the moment, that it is sort of appearing that, men are not doing their whack, even in families where both of them work full-time. But actually, I will be sympathetic with men, because I think they have a lot of pressures on them as to what is expected of them, which is no longer so, because, yes, they are no longer the breadwinner. In a lot of cases, women are earning as much or more, and in some cases, men are struggling in that way and finding it very difficult, because that's not what they expect they should be doing.
And it's sort of expectations lagging behind there, isn't it, that idea of who's who?
Yeah, who's who, how do you do it, and then how do you prioritize? And so the feeling that sometimes, because after all you go out to work and that's where you get your value, because that's where you get paid, that has to be the important thing that we put first. And of course, when we come home and there's children calling for attention, our parents, our partners calling for attention, maybe the other people in the household calling for attention, we feel, well, that the work must come first. And because of the changes in society, the internet, etc., work can be chasing us, and we can keep going back to thinking that's what we ought to be doing, rather than looking at our family. And there are tremendous changes going on, and we need to keep up with it. And the only way to do that is to keep talking. And I suppose one of the things I want to flag up very strongly is that if we were at work, we would know if I have a problem, there should be a solution that I can come to by discussing it and looking for that solution. I think sometimes on the home field, we rather think, well, that's how it's always been. I'm inadequate if I'm not making it work. But I'm not thinking in terms of, hang on, there's a problem here, let's talk it through, and let's look for a solution that works for everybody. So it really is about importing into the home place what we might have become used to in work, which is look at something, think about it, discuss it, see what works best, and work that out together. And it may not be what works for next door or your friends or your family, but if it works for you, then that's the way to do it.
And absolutely, that communication, the key point to all of this. And it can fall off the list, can't it, in the middle of doing everything. It can feel, if we're not careful, just like another thing we've got to try and get right, another thing we've got to try and do, have that conversation. Yeah. It's how we integrate that sort of, that constant interaction.
It's realizing that talking is something that actually makes us feel good. It's not just about communicating and getting things done by talking it through and having a plan. It's also about bonding, and you talked about multiple attachments with children. Children need to see their parents talking to each other and coming up with plans. That's the model that they would like to follow. Children need to hear their parents talking to them from a very, very early age. There needs to be conversation going on around children and with children. There needs to be eye contact. There needs to be voices heard. There needs to be listening to what everybody is saying. That whole thing about communication is always two-way. It's as much about listening as about talking. But children need to see that, and we need to do it between ourselves, and then we need to do it with them, and we need to allow them to actually be talking to us, and we need to be listening to them as well.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Susie. So, one of the things I think is important as we go on is how we set the parameters, because like we've said, we've got very much a change in the way we work. I think we're going to see that increasingly with Generation Y. How do we set our own parameters? That's the key, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true because, again, if you're going to be working, because we've got the technology, there is going to be a lot more home working. How are we going to, set either a place in the house, which is where we work, and then we close the door at the end of the day, or a time at which, or times at which we set that aside and step away. And this transition thing, I think the idea of, transition times, being consistent is incredibly important. That you have your plan and you keep to your rules. So you may be saying to your children, we don't have Facebook on, we don't do these sorts of things at this time of the day, or these times, or when we're at the table, or whatever. You have to keep that rule as well. You have to be consistent with them and also keep those rules to yourself. But also this bit about the transition times, going from being, the person who is a working person with all the expectations you have of yourself as a working person and the way you work, to being someone who is now at home, soft, listening to people, doing things in different ways. And sometimes that can be quite an abrupt change. It's a bit easier if you're commuting, because actually, in a sense, that's the time when you can shed that. Maybe read a book, do something that seeks you from one part of your life and one part of your personality to another. If you're a home worker, actually, it's quite difficult to do that. And I think a ritual. I have an end-of-day ritual, which is yes, I turn off my computer, I close the door, I go and have a bath. With a cat sitting on the side of the bath and maybe a drink of something. It is that, washing the day away in a sense, but it really does form a boundary beyond which I'm now in my home life, my home person. And I think it's, it can be, I remember counselling a guy who had a real problem with his family, and what we came up with is the idea is when he came home, he would say, leave me alone for 5 minutes. He'd go upstairs, he'd have a shower, and he'd listen to a couple of tracks on his iPod. And that would be his end-of-day ritual, and then he was available to his family. And once he started doing that, all the arguments just melted away.
Yeah, and it's tuning in, isn't it? Sometimes I think when we're at full stretch and feeling time poor, we don't always acknowledge the transition. So you can be on a busy commute, but it's actually tuning into the fact that this is, as you say, you're shedding the day. There's something going on here.
Let it go. And recognize pinch points. We mentioned pinch points, but can I just quickly go back to that, which is the idea that there are certain points in your life, in a family's life, in your children's life, where things get pinched. And they are the same for everybody. So certain points in your life where you change from one situation to another. And for kids, it may be things like, first school, going to big school, seeing their parents, maybe, in yourself, it may be, going from honeymoon, let's say, to living together in a humdrum way. There are certain places, there are certain points in your life where everybody would find that transition difficult. And you need to recognize that if you're struggling with it, it's not you being incompetent or incapable. It's not you being stupid. It's you actually reacting quite normally and naturally to the fact that at that time you are pinched. And I think if we're aware of it and we can see it coming up, this is going to happen. We're about to go on Christmas holiday, for instance. Christmas holidays, delightful, wonderful, marvelous, but actually there can be very stressful times because all sorts of emotions come in on that. And if you are aware of the fact that there could be some difficulty here, think about it beforehand. Just flag up the fact that this is a pinch point. That actually makes it much easier to handle.
And I think as well, I've got better at this, but I often think to myself, oh, great, holiday coming. But of course, a half-term break or the summer when the children are around, it's not quite the holiday it was. So, it's anticipating the challenge. And yes, it's a change of pace and a change of scene, and that's lovely, but knowing that, you're not going to get to read that book necessarily, depending on the ages of your kids, but being able to see it coming, really, and anticipate.
Planning forward and deciding what do I want out of this and how am I going to get it? Because the point is, if you decided what do you want and then started asking the question, how am I going to get it, you might get it. If you just go along thinking somehow it'll sort itself out, it won't.
And I like your point, Susie, about we're modelling to the children. So in terms of mobile phone use or the smart technology we have around us now, we in a way of a certain age where that's kind of come upon us, and we don't necessarily have the discipline that I certainly see my children hearing a lot more about at school. They're learning how to set the parameters, they're learning how to use that rather than have the technology use them.
And we're not.
We're not as good at it.
No, and I saw a figure the other day, which is that the average person picks up their phone over 200 times in 24 hours.
Wow.
And of course, notice 24 hours, because that's the whole point of mobile phones. They're with you all the time. But people are constantly referring to the phone because they have it on. And one of the things I suggest very strongly in families is when you come home in the evening, everybody turn off. And so the first half hour or other is very much reconnecting with the family or reconnecting with yourself, having that quiet time, but coming together and chatting. You may then have agreed check-in points where you go and see what your friends are doing or whatever. But, certain points in the evening, it's really important that everything's off and you are communicating around a table, eating together. And absolute no-no is taking any sort of screens into the bedroom. Just shouldn't do it.
Yeah, great. And this is a new territory, isn't it, in terms of what we saw growing up on.
And we're learning, and we know actually we're beginning to see the harm of it. I think that's the point. And it's very good that a lot of schools are actually talking about this, and a lot of young people are thinking about it a lot more. But I have to say, not all schools are, and not all young people are, and certainly not all families are. It's a really big. I mean, there's so many things that are just more of the same. So many problems that I get as an agony aunt that really are very similar. There's just maybe a high gloss in it, a high-tech gloss on it, but it's not much different. But this is something actually that is a bit new, the effect that screens are having on mental capacity, mental development, all those sorts of things, particularly for young children, but even in adults. It's, we're now beginning to get worried because we can see it happening. We need to get a grip and actually start thinking in terms of monitoring and limiting and getting control of it rather than letting it run away.
And I was reading something interesting the other day about we actually get a little dopamine high. We get a little lift when we hear an email come in or a text come in. There's neurological stuff going on. It's almost like the smoking of our generation, isn't it? This is something we've got to this addiction.
Well, this is how Pavlov did his dogs. Rang a bell, and they salivated because they knew the food was coming. And even when the food didn't come, ring the bell and they would salivate. Well, in a sense, we are conditioning ourselves to do the same thing. Oh, emails come in. Oh, there's a tweet or something. And I think acknowledging the fact that we're getting a kick out of this, when perhaps, fine, it's nice to get a kick out of people communicating with you. Another kick that you should be getting is sitting around a table and chatting with your children and your partner. And that, really is a very important kick that seems to sometimes go by the board because everybody feels they're so busy. They should be in their rooms, Facebooking friends, doing this, doing that, working. This is what prioritizing is all about. Sometimes work is terribly important, and there may be some days where you say, that's actually what I must be doing at the moment. But you have to be flexible, and sometimes you have to say, nope, family is important. That has to go by the board, and I have to be in the room, in the moment, with my partner and with my family.
Great. Thanks. And I think some of this ties into the idea of the bigger vision or the longer view on all of this, isn't it? What are we doing? These are key moments with our children or young families. So how might we look back on this time?
Absolutely. I mean, I did a book a couple of years ago, and this was based on a study that had been made about people's regrets in their last days. And what kept coming up again and again. Nobody said, I wish I'd spent more time at work. But an awful lot of people were saying, I wish I'd spent more time with my family. And that was a real regret that came back to so many people. And people talk about, I'm really busy. I'm incredibly busy. But you have to make the time. Again, one of my favorite sort of catchphrases is, you don't ask a person who has time to do something. You ask a busy person who will make time. Well, it's the same thing. Make that time to do the important things in your life. Free up that schedule to have another schedule, which is looking at your family and looking at the really important things, because that communication is incredibly important. And you need sometimes to persist. I mean, I talk about, sharing the meal. There are lots of things you can share with family, lots of time you can share with family that builds that bond, makes that attachment. And yes, when it's certainly young children, it's actually growing brain capacity. But you sometimes have to persist. I mean, one of my favorite things that I always remember is when I did my Relate training many years ago, and I came back full of all the tips and the techniques and the strategies of, thanking and doing all these things, and I started trying them out. And my husband sort of looked at me as if I was crazy. Why are you thanking me for making you a cup of tea? Of course I do this. And my stepson, don't you come to counseling with me. They got very irritated by it all. I persisted, and it wasn't very long afterwards that they both came back and said, oh, actually, it's rather nice. Yeah, I like this. It's right. So I think sometimes when you try and carve up time with family, free up your schedule, you might, find them saying, oh, we're not really interested. Persist, because eventually you will find doing the right thing actually does work, and it does make everybody happy, and that's where they get the dopamine from.
Yeah, and I think some of this is not, we tend to think, oh, it's going wrong, we're not getting this right. We can't get it right all the time because, for many of us, there's a lot on our plate. But I think if we just take something and say, you know what, even if once a week we get to sit around a table together, let's just aim at something.
Aim at something. And the interesting thing from it is if you try it once, again, looking at some families I worked with where, oh, it's impossible. They all want different food, and I can't do this and I can't do that. And I sort of say, right, try it once and see what happens. And they try it once, and everybody grumbles and hates it. And then a week later they're saying, oh, could we do that again? And you will find sometimes the things that the kids will, and the partners will not value, actually, in retrospect, they will value very much. And then all of a sudden you'll find you're not doing it once a week, you're doing it every night of the week, because there is a payoff, and everybody values it.
Sure, thanks, Susie. And I think, it's that time to just stop when the conversations can happen. I often find myself, I catch myself asking things when I'm kind of on the hoof or not really available to listen to the answer, whether it's talking to the children or my partner, we're not really able to answer fully, but you're kind of going through the motions of asking them, how's your day, or whatever it might be. But it is, really important that we kind of think about when we're asking. I just want to run a poll. I'll take our first poll now just to get a snapshot of what people are thinking about. And what we're asking here is, what's the most important ingredient? And you may want to choose more than one, but you may have a strong sense of what we've got down there. Timing, whether it's honesty, saying less. In some cases, I can catch myself doing too much of the talking. Or is it listening? But take a look at see what people are thinking there. So on timing, it's very interesting. One of my experiences in our family is that I will want to find out how the children's day is going. And you don't actually hear anything about that because you ask it and you just get a grunt. But with my younger children, but sometimes they don't want to tell you till, they're procrastinating or getting into bed, for example, and then suddenly it's chapter and verse. So
till they're ready sometimes.
Yes. And it might be tuning in and saying, well, do you know what, we'll have that conversation then. So we've sort of built in a little family routine where we're kind of giving our top 3 things of the day that we share at the end of the day. And that's a great way to kind of hear what's going on rather than seeing the moody face and saying, what's up with you? It won't come out then. It won't necessarily come out when you want it to.
No, I mean, it's things like open questions are so important. So you don't say, did you have a good day? You say, tell me about your day.
Yes.
Because for a start, it may not have been good, and they do want to tell you that. But if they feel you want it to be good, they can't admit it.
Yeah.
So it's really the open question. And as you said, it is out of experience choosing your time. And I do think the going to bed thing, the making time, actually, having bedtime for even teenagers, recognizing they need an awful lot of sleep, a lot more sleep than they think. I know that a few schools are now going to be trying starting later for teenagers, which is a wonderful idea. But, getting there 9 hours actually is quite important. So setting a ritual of, the calm down, screens off, calm down, have a bath, and then go to bed. And that's what the carrot you offer them is, that's when I'll come in and we can chat.
Yes.
And from little children right up to hulking great big teenagers, just love that time of, it's our time when we can talk to each other. And I love it.
Great. Well, look at this listening. We've got a lot of interesting answers here, nice round figures. We've got listening clearly high on everybody's agenda, but also timing and honesty.
Important.
I think your point as well earlier, Susie, around persistence, that it's not just getting this right some of the time, or perhaps getting it right and getting the wrong response, and then not trying again, but keeping it going, trying to get that routine established.
Keep going, and be forgiving of yourself if it doesn't work, and forgiving of them if it doesn't work at once. But and if it's something that isn't working, well, fine, okay, find something else. But you do sometimes just have to persist and keep in on there, because I think that the most important thing, and funnily enough, actually that poll, those are the ingredients for what I would say was the most important thing, which is being heard. In other words, you need to have the feeling that the other person heard you, and that's more of, that's listening to you, but also, really took it on board, and they need to have the feeling that you heard them, and it has to be the mutual thing, because communication has to be two-way. both of you have to feel that you were heard, and that's the most important thing, I think, in communication and in an effective conversation, whether it's at work or at home.
Great. And I think, many of those older parents, today, we're having our children a bit later, sometimes that means we have more expectation. That's a great thing, we have higher expectation. But if they get too unrealistic, then we're transferring our professional mode into home life. That's where we get a bit unstuck, isn't it?
I think it's really hard because, in a sense, at work, we do rather feel that we have to be near perfection. That's what we're striving for, is to be perfect and professional. And we then go home trying to sort of take that perfectionism and, putting the standards, as it were, on ourselves at home. And we want to be the best. And certainly, people think about being the perfect parent with the perfect children and, the best carer, all these sorts of things. That is such a pressure, because actually I don't think, I can just about think you might get near perfection in your profession. I'm pretty good, but I still wouldn't sound perfect. But I really wouldn't want to be thinking of myself as a perfect parent or having my child be a perfect child. You can't do it. And, in a sense, it means that then you hit up on yourself if you fail, because you think you've fallen off the pedestal, rather than just, well, that's being human. One can make mistakes. I think the concept that's really, really important is the good enough one. And that was one that was invented by a wonderful psychologist, I think, called Bruno Bettelheim. And this was the idea of being good enough. And good enough means, being realistic, recognizing when things are really, bearing down on you, but making that effort always to listen. But it's accepting that you can't get it right all the time. It's asking those open questions. It's listening. It's being patient with yourself and patient with other people. But that's what you're striving to be. Not perfect, but just good enough. Because good enough is actually good enough. It's what is needed. The loving parent, the loving partner, the person who's there when you need them, but the person that can also turn around sometimes and say, I'm furious, and I've absolutely mucked up on that, and I'm really sorry, but let's try again. But that's okay. That's being good enough.
I think that's a really important point. Interesting in the registration data, the idea of arguments coming up, not to end each day arguing and shouting. I think sometimes, it's hard to avoid that. We're feeling feeling the pressure, not getting enough sleep, in the early days of very young children maybe, or when work demands are high. But I think, sometimes acknowledging when there's been a bit of a shout, that you are able to share with children that, you're not particularly proud of that. Do you see how that happened? Do you see what I was asking? I find that's quite effective to...
It's very effective to say, Mummy or Daddy made a mistake and mucked up that time, and, I am only human, and I'm sorry. I think sometimes parents are frightened of admitting that they got it wrong to their children. They think that somehow they're letting the other side. Parents have to be perfect, and therefore you don't say you're sorry. You don't sort of erase yourself in front of your children. I think that is so wrong, because again, it's modeling. If you want to model to them the fact that sometimes they can step down, they can step back and say, I got that wrong, I'm sorry, let's do it a different way. You have to model it, you have to do it yourself. And I think with partners as well, I think there are times, I think one of my biggest hatreds of all, if anybody remembers that awful film Love Story, and the catchphrase was, love was never having to say you're sorry. Oh yes, it is. Love actually is being able to say, I got that wrong, and I'm really sorry, and I'm going to try better next time. And I think we have to be able to do this for our children and with our partners, and we have to be realistic about what we can and can't do, and sometimes step back.
Right. And just interesting on that point about talking, that there are very real strategies, and how we say things can have enormous impact, can't it?
We mentioned tone, and I think that's incredibly important, because I can't remember the exact figure, but I know that the percentage of meaning that comes over in your words is actually a minority of what's getting across your meaning. It's your tone, it's your body stance, where you're looking, how you're standing. All those things actually get more of your meaning across than the words themselves. And again, the sorts of words you're choosing, and of course one of the really classic ones that I think we need to pay attention to is what we call I statements. Because what often happens in an argument, if you start saying you make me angry, look at what you did, look at what you made me do, you're lazy, you're this, you're that. And the person, of course, defends themselves by saying, I didn't do that, or I didn't mean that, no, I'm not. or actually feels labelled and just crawls away, and you're having conflict with no communication. What is really important to cling on to is I statements, which actually say not what the other person did, but what you feel. I feel angry when, and sometimes it can be when you do this, but it's often just I feel angry when. I feel disappointed. I feel upset. You're actually telling the person where you stand. Nobody can then argue with, well, you don't feel angry. Oh, hang on. Well, okay, you're telling me you feel angry. What are you angry about? What can we do about this? You are putting, you're showing your own feelings and saying, this is the problem. What are we going to do about it? And the phrase that I often like is there's a four-part, which is I feel because, or when. You started with saying, when this happens, I feel, whatever, because, and you explain why, what I would like is. And if you use that four-part, when, I feel, because, what I would like is, you're actually expressing your feelings. You're telling the person quite specifically what it is that's upsetting you, and then you're enlisting them in being part of the solution rather than all of the problem to actually get this solved. Much, much better than just shouting. So you can raise your voice. Yes, yes, you can get angry. But if you cling on to that thing of making I statements rather than you statements and making your feelings, absolutely clear as to what's going wrong, how you can change it, you will get somewhere.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think sometimes we kind of just want partners to notice, or we want loved ones to just be aware, or part of it is, just understanding. But actually, when we are absolutely full on with work and family in particular, it's very hard then. That expectation is too high. We need to state what it is we need. It's not going to be discerned because there isn't really space or energy or room for that all the time. When we're talking about those pinch points or the pressure points of young children in the household.
Yeah, I shout, I lose my temper. But I'll always go back and apologize, and I'll always manage to analyze what went wrong here and what I was angry about. And of course, sometimes you're actually having an argument about something that is nothing to do with what is really upsetting you. And that's the most interesting point, that often, and I call it kicking the cat, that often you come home angry with something and you kick the poor cat. And the cat, what was all that about? Why were you angry with me? Well, actually, I wasn't. I was angry about something else, but it got channeled into this particular argument. And so often arguments are about things that are nothing to do with what's really being shouted about, or it's about the past. It's about, and it's really meaning, do you love me and do you pay attention to me and do you value me? And maybe that's the question you should be asking rather than having the argument that appears to be the thing that's triggered you. So it's always ask yourself, what is this about? Have I felt like this before? When? What was it about there? Should we be talking about the underlying problem rather than the thing we're having a fight about?
Great, thank you, Susie. And we were talking earlier about tone and your body language, but back to words, sometimes there is too much criticism going on and not enough praise, and it's certainly relevant with children, but I think it's relevant with the whole family.
You will reinforce behavior if you concentrate on the behavior. So if all you're ever doing is shouting at people for what they didn't do, that's all they're hearing. Tell a child, please don't stick beans up your nose, and all they'll hear is beans and nose, and start sticking things up their nose. That's what they hear. Please don't run about in the supermarket shouting. They hear run about in the supermarket shouting. What you say actually is what, as I said, is reinforced. So the best thing to do, in fact, is to acknowledge the effort. I saw you really tried that you tried very hard in trying to do that. Let's see if we can help you do it better next time. But I like the fact that you made the effort. And praise. If you praise people for what they do right and ignore what they've done wrong, what they'll want reinforced is the fact that, they got it right. And they know what they got right. If you give it in descriptive praise, in other words, you don't just say, good boy. You say, you tidied up your toys without my having to ask. Oh, yes, I did, didn't I? I can do that. Right, next time I'm going to do it because then I get praised again. So praise often and criticize less. It is far, far more effective. And always think about the tone of the body language. I mean, I think one of the things it's very easy to fall into with teenagers, to start being sarcastic or to tease them because they get up our nose and, you get angry with them. And our aggression or our anger comes out in that sort of rather sideways way of being sarcastic. You need to be congruent. In other words, you need to, when you're happy, smile. When you're not happy, show and say, I'm not happy about this. I am feeling angry. But think about your tone and your body language and actually recognize that you do convey an awful lot in it. So if you're really angry with a child, take a deep breath, put it in words, but then say, let's talk about it later on when I've actually got my temper back. Remember that tone and body language say as much as the words. And sometimes, of course, what they're doing is saying something different from what you're trying to say. It's important to get the two going together.
Thanks, Susie. And we'll talk in a moment about how we set aside time in our partnerships to do that as well. I just wanted to take a pause for a moment now for questions. We've had one in here on resentment. How do I get away from feelings of resentment almost happening to me now on a daily basis? So while we take that question, just inviting others if they'd like to add in comments and questions too. So Susie, what do we do with that feeling? How do we get over it?
We have to bring it out in the open, and what often happens with resentment, of course, is it simmers under the surface. There's something we're resenting, there's something we're upset about, and actually what we do is we grit our teeth. But our aggression leaks out in other ways, and so we're not happy. Our partner or the child learns pretty soon that we're not happy with them, but they may not be quite clear as to why, because we haven't put it in words. Genuinely, sometimes the other person doesn't realize what you're upset about unless you tell them clearly. And the resentment builds up. You feel, you've been wronged, and they might be puzzled. Or even if they do know what it's all about, they're still rather stuck because you're not having a conversation. All they're getting is they're getting it in the neck. So the first thing to do is actually say to someone quite clearly, I'm getting upset about this. I really do think we need to set a time to sit down and talk about it. And marshal your thoughts about what it is you'd like to tell the other person, and give them a chance to actually then say to you what they've thought. One thing I find is very effective is to use a timer, to actually say, I get 2 minutes to say what I feel, and then you have 2 minutes to say what you feel. And not that it's a question and answer, it's that think beforehand what you would like to say about this particular issue. I'm going to have my 2 minutes, and then you can have your 2 minutes, and both of us will listen to the other, and then at the end, when we both have our 2 minutes, we'll talk it through. But it is very much about, as I said, in a work situation, you'd be able to do this. You'd write your list, and you'd say, let's have a discussion at a time when we're feeling okay. Do it at home as well. But really important not to let it go on brewing. Because then actually what sometimes happens is you forget what you were resentful about in the first place. You're just in a situation where you've got months or sometimes years and decades of resentment and anger, and then it's really, really difficult to put it back and get together again.
I really like that idea of the timer. I've seen that used quite effectively in a different context, actually, but the idea of not being able to say anything. Because I think sometimes conflict escalates because someone will start with, I'm feeling this. Well, you're feeling that, I'm feeling that, and suddenly it's about you. But actually being forced and having that as a ritual that you're going to just speak for 2 minutes, and then the other person can speak for 2 minutes.
And the other person has to be actively listening, and active listening is about eye contact, nodding, saying, urging the person on, but not being able to say a word. And then you swap it round. And then you actually can talk about, well, how did it feel to be in that situation of either being heard without being interrupted or having to listen without interrupting. And what did you hear? What did you listen? And you could also then do it with what's called reflective listening, which is instead of the ums and ahs, you actually start saying, oh, well, I understand that. You reflect back to the person what you've heard. Are you saying that? Am I hearing that? It sounds to me as what you're saying is. That makes you really think about what the other person is saying. You're not thinking about your answer. You're thinking about understanding what they said to you. That can be very powerful.
Great. I'm just aware of time. I'm going to move us on. Please do keep typing questions. Some of the ones that we've received, we're going to come to some answers, I hope, in the last part now, entering into your final section of today's webinar. But do keep typing them, and if we don't answer them, give me a prompt. But I want to move us towards this idea of losing the couple, if you like, whether you're in relationship or whether you're separated or divorced. The importance of staying positive and effective in that partnership. We know, don't we, children and other loved ones, they thrive best, really, when parents or when couples are happy and are collaborative.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And when they've actually asked children, interesting, asked parents how important it is, they think, to kids for you to be getting on well. And I think it's 7 out of 10 parents say it's not important. And if you ask kids, 7 out of 10 say it's vital to them. Children want their parents to be happy together or to be communicating together, even if actually you've separated. They want you to be communicating and to like and know each other, and for them not to have to feel guilty about it. So it's really important for you to spend time and effort on that relationship, not to feel guilty. I think so many parents feel they should be giving all their free time to their kids. Your kids would be far happier if you actually specifically made time for yourselves as a couple to strengthen that bond and to show them This is what happy people do. This is what couples do. They spend time together. They go off and do stuff together. And they're happy doing so. Really good model for them to be able to actually follow.
And I think as well for partners, often whether it's work shouting the loudest or children shouting the loudest, we can lose the other, can't we, in this?
Very much so, and this again is almost back to the the turn off the phones. That sometimes it's whatever attracts your attention, whether it's the person who's shouting the loudest, and therefore toddlers, and teenagers can get it, or a very angry partner, or if it's the phone that's ringing or the the tablet that's pinging, that we switch to that because it seems to be the one that's calling us the most. You need to think in priorities. You need to think in terms of, my love may be infinite and my attention in a sense is infinite, but actually my time isn't. Therefore, everybody needs a share. And how am I going to divvy this up, and how am I going to do it? And sometimes I'm going to, have to look at the child who's not saying a thing. I think any parent with small children knows sometimes when that silence falls, actually that's the time to get worried. What are they doing? But also, if people aren't talking to you, well, they're switching off. And that is not a good thing. So you have to keep that conversation going with everybody, not just the ones who are demanding your attention.
And as we said before, I think, it's about making time, because often we can be a bit lazy in our questioning. How was your day? How are you doing? Why are you moody? But actually, that's not going to necessarily be the right time to elicit the best response.
Date nights. I think time with children. That last thing at night, the chat, the reading the book, or having a chat together. That's really important to make that and keep to it. Scheduling, the catch-up times, but also, the times out, so that, for instance, each child, you spend some time with them alone. So you might take a child out on their own, not with the other children. Give everybody a bit of time. Both parents give everybody a bit of time. But also, you have date nights, and that absolutely should be set in stone, that partners of whatever, however long they've been together, you must have those date nights. And actually, I'd even say it for people who are separated, that if you've got children, sometimes the only time you'll talk is about the kids. Actually, have an occasional time when you meet up with your ex-partner to just have a chat about where are you and what are you doing, so that you're keeping that connection going for your children to see that you still have a connection. Not a romantic one, but a civilized one, and that's really, really important for you, for them as well as for you. And I think it's about the sharing. It's sharing what I think, what I feel, what's going on in me, and tell me what what's going on in you. That's the communication bit. That's the connection. And connections are really so important.
And I think as well that recognizing it's not easy. I think, we are surrounded by images where it all seems to be roses and, the Hollywood notion of how things should be, which is nowhere near the everyday in most cases, depending on the movie. But I just think it's tough, isn't it? If we can get this right some of the time, we're doing all right.
Absolutely. And it's very interesting. I rather like this graphic here. And I'm not, it has a double meaning, because on one hand you could say, well, this is actually demonstrating, look, we have a connection. I'm hauling you along. I'm helping you. You may be I may be pulling you up the cliff or whatever. But it could also actually be we're pulling apart, and one person is facing away from someone, and that's actually what sometimes happens. It is a tough job. Sometimes it does feel as if we're pulling in separate directions. Sometimes we're pulling in the same direction. Sometimes we're walking along side by side. And all those things actually are important at various times. But it's about discussing what we've got on our plate and how we're going to work it out, to make sure that we can be side by side in the pressures, that we sort of give a united front to our children, not always necessarily saying the same thing. It's quite okay to be able to say, well, Mum says this and Dad says this, as long as what you're agreed about is the really important essentials, and you're agreed about talking it through, then your children, that again, it's a model for your children on there is a solution. You can find it if you talk to each other.
And in a way, there's two layers to this. There's a sort of, in just listening to what you're saying, Susie, there's almost the bigger picture conversations that have to take place, whether that's around career and hours and who's managing what. And those the sort of longer term, this is how we're going to do it. But then really, there's that other layer of just things like who's doing the laundry, who is going to be picking up this week, or what's happening this weekend, and it's that every day that we almost need to sit down and
you have to talk it through. I mean, a few years ago, my husband and I did exactly this. We really did sit down, and it was literally, what do we have to do to keep this house running? What do we have to do to keep our sort of business, as it were, running? Who does what? And we did draw up the list. And it did then get, there were a few things, well, actually, I'll do that, or there's quite a few things that we share, or sometimes I do it, sometimes he does it. But it's an acknowledgement of there are all these things that happen, that need doing, and we need to talk it through to make sure they get done and nobody feels resentment or left out, or, or that they're expected to do much. It is about drawing up that list and talking about it. And I think children need to be part of it as well. I'm really hugely in favour of family round tables, where you do get together fairly regularly and everybody gets a chance to have a say, and then you brainstorm and you can draw up family rules and you draw up family chore charts, because even very small children can be doing their share around the house. And again, it's the acknowledgement of you're part of this, because if you're actually working in the house, you're part of that household, rather than being, somebody who's just staying, somebody who's a guest. No, we're all sharing this together, because it is a tough job. Living is a tough job. You have to work hard at it. Things don't happen just out of the blue. They happen because you make them happen. That's a very good lesson for children, that actually you get somewhere in life if you actually make it happen, rather than letting things happen to you.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's sometimes being able to let go, isn't it? If you are the one who's holding it all together, resentfully or otherwise, it's very hard for you to relinquish some of that.
I accept the fact that some of my underwear is pink where it shouldn't be pink, because actually my husband does the washing. And I'm afraid, as a woman and as a mother, you really have to make yourself accept that sometimes jobs aren't done to your standards. It doesn't matter as long as they get done by other people and they feel, they're trying hard. They'll get better at it when they realize, yes, this is something they have to do. And they'll start noticing maybe they don't want pink underwear, and they'll work a bit harder. Well, sometimes they don't, because that's, we do have different standards. But what is the most important thing, in fact, is to share it around, because it's much better to have pink underwear than to have to do all the work yourself and then feel resentful about that.
Great, really helpful, thank you. And also looking beyond the partnership. I mean, in this case here, it's hard. We don't work in isolation. We don't live in isolation, we'd hope. Certainly for my family, we do depend on reciprocal arrangements in our community. We've got a fantastic support network, and I think that can be key as well, letting people in and accepting that help. It takes a village to raise a child, as they say, and I think letting people in is incredibly important. And again, this is back to the being good enough. You're not perfect. You can't do it all, and you can't do it all perfectly. And you should not have any guilt about either sharing chores with other people, I'll do this for you, you do that for me, or paying people if you can to do work for you. That's absolutely fine. You're paying a salary, wonderful. And being supportive, being part of a support network that you ask as well as give. You do obviously have to keep an eye on, am I giving more or am I asking more? It's got to be fair. But I think people thrive on that sense of communities. Communities are really useful, of all sorts. And it's important, again, it's an example to your children. But it's also actually about, I think it shows the partnership level with your partner. If you're also relying on other people, you're almost reinforcing the fact that we aren't islands on our own. We do rely on other people. We're friends, we pull together, we get other people to help us as well, and we help other people. And as I said, I don't think there should be any guilt in that. And sometimes, I mean, it's really helpful. It also, builds those bonds. Things like agreeing, shared babysitting or, childcare during school holidays, things like that. You find yourself building up friendships that otherwise you might not have had with people that you might not have thought you would be friends with. The only link is your child. Actually, that's really useful and that's really nice. Actually, it's good parenting. It's part of the definition of good parenting is to involve others in that caring, whatever the responsibility is.
Yeah, children need multiple attachments. And you need to let go sometimes and let them do this. It's good for them and it's good for you as well.
Thanks, Susie. Well, I'm going to launch our final poll as we move into the remaining minutes of the webinar. Just a kind of call to action, really. So what's the most important thing for you to do next? Are there things that Susie's been talking as we've been looking at the topic today that you really feel, oh yeah, that's what I'm getting wrong, or that's what I could be doing more of? Just a moment for you to take a look at the options there. And it's important, isn't it, Susie, to say it's about starting small, incremental steps, really.
Oh, little by little. Sometimes people do get rather foxed by the idea. They look and they think, oh my God, this is a massive problem. I can't solve it, therefore I'm just going to collapse in a heap. Literally, it is that one step, that one little change. we should also, I think, take a lesson from, is it David Brailsford, the man who organised the cycling teams, Sky cycling team. And you look at his successes, and what he did was his watchword was a 10% change in everything. And of course, a 10% here and a 10% there and a 10% everywhere else added up to our getting massive number of medals in, at the London Olympics, and of course winning the Tour de France 2 years running. That's all about looking at the tiny changes. Make one little change, and you'll find that you then feel good because you've made a change. Even if it doesn't seem to change everything, it changes one thing. Eventually, you'll find you've built up one change, one change, one change. You've reached your goal without really realizing. You've gone up that mountain. You looked at it from the valley and thought, my goodness, that's far too high to get. You've one foot in front of another, and you eventually get there. So yes, don't feel that you've got to do it all at once. You do it one step at a time.
Lovely, thanks, Susie. So here we've got, I'm just going to close the poll. Thanks for voting, those of you who have. Yeah, listening skills coming out on top there.
That's good.
Not easy, but it's an aspiration.
It's a good aspiration. I do think that's actually one of the most important. I mean, again, it's back to my being heard. You can't be heard unless you're prepared to listen to the other person, which then gives them the opportunity to listen to you. So I think that actually is where it really does start with, is getting that ability to zip your mouth and listen to the other person and let them know that you're being listened to, and then asking them to do the same. And
that links in with how you say things. Because we're listening well, we kind of get a better handle on how we should be saying things, don't we?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for voting in there. Just want to show you some of the resources that we've put together, and to remind you that there will be, those of you who've joined later, I mentioned at the beginning that we're going to have a follow-up document. We're going to pull together some of the themes, some of the questions, and some of the registration points raised into a two-sider, which will hopefully capture some of what we've had on the slides and some of the conversation today. And we'll include these resources on there, so hopefully you can revisit. A lot of these are, we've got Susie, two of many of her titles up there, very helpful reads, and also the second two titles here, really looking at the changing context that we started with, that idea that we need to revisit all aspects. And the workplace is changing, what we've talked about in terms of male-female working patterns and priorities, it's all changing, but how is that translating into the home? Really, really worth reading around both of those there.